Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Second Chances, which is episode 24 of season 6 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 6th season episode, Second Chances. So Second Chances is the episode where Riker beams down with the way team to a planet that he visited 8 years ago that apparently has some weird field that doesn't allow people to beam down there. Every 8 years it allows people to beam down, the field goes away, and they beam down and find that it's already occupied with William Riker, another version of Riker. And so they beam him aboard and question if he's an imposter, but they find out that he is in fact also William Riker, that there are two William Rikers. That last time he visited the planet, when he was beamed up, they have trouble beaming him up, and the transporter chief initiated a second beam to try to stabilize the beam, but then found it was unnecessary, so just let it go and thought it would just dissipate and disappear. But the weird atmosphere of the planet trapped that second beam and had it materialize on the planet. So up to that point, these two people were the same person, but after the transporter accident, they diverged, and they're both the real William Riker. But since then, their memories or their experiences has shaped who they are differently. Lieutenant Riker has a hard time following orders, and William Riker, Commander Riker, doesn't get along with him very well. But Lieutenant Riker wants to re-spark his relationship with Deanna Troi, because, and as far as he's concerned, they never broke up, and he was just wanting to be with her the whole time. And they form a little romance, but Commander Riker warns Deanna to be careful. So after a little bit of struggling between Commander Riker and Lieutenant Riker, they work together, and Commander Riker even saves Lieutenant Riker's life, and they sort things out. But Lieutenant Riker gets assigned to a different ship because he can't be on board with the Commander Riker on the same ship, but Deanna Troi refuses to go with him because she values her career and life on the Enterprise too much, and so basically the two of them separate. But before going, Lieutenant Riker informs Commander Riker that he's going to go by Thomas Riker instead of William Riker to differentiate himself. This episode's kind of just fine. This is another episode that's just kind of okay. It's not one that stuck out to me as being particularly good or particularly bad. It's funny because I've heard a lot of people who love this episode and think it's like really great. Yeah, I didn't feel that way about it. Now, a couple of things I'm going to start out with. First one I think I gotta mention is Lower Decks. Because I can't help but thinking of Lower Decks as the show, not the episode, as I was watching this. Because if you haven't seen Lower Decks, they do a little gag about this episode, because Boimler this is when he's on the Titan under the command of Captain Riker, and he is trapped on the planet, and the way team's trapped and they're getting attacked, and he doesn't know what to do, and then they can't beam up because there's something blocking him. But then he realizes that if they do the same thing that was done in this episode to create, or at least mentioned in this episode, to create the other Riker, that they can use that same technique to beam them aboard. So they beam them aboard, and everything seems to be safe. But then another version of Boimler comes on board, gets on the shuttlecraft and leaves the surface and come on board. And now there's two Boimlers, and Riker's like, "Oh yeah, I've been there." And of course, the other Boimler starts to call himself William Boimler, which I think it was absolutely hilarious. And then they turn it into like evil twin trope. They kind of imply that William Boimler's like faked his death and joined Section 31 is going to be evil, but I'm still waiting to see if Season 5, because as the recording of this video is before Season 5 came out, still waiting to see if they will cover that. But anyway, it was nice little reference making fun of this episode. I think to me that's really the most significant thing about this episode now, because I gotta be honest, it is kind of forgettable. Now, Thomas Riker, of course, would make another appearance in the episode Defiant on D Space Nine, which I'll get to in good time because I am going per air date. Honestly, and I honestly feel... Actually, I already reviewed that episode, sorry. But I will cover it in the Revisited. But I honestly feel like... And I think I probably mentioned this in my review for that episode, too. Is that that episode changed Thomas's character. Like, it was inconsistent with how his character was portrayed here. Because here, he was portrayed as wanting to further his career and career goals and being totally in love with Deanna Troi, whereas in that episode he quit Starfleet, became a fugitive in order to join the Maquis, and had a little romance with Kira. Now, I understand you could say years have passed and maybe like he became sort of really distraught with the fact that his whole life and career was overshadowed by the other William Riker, and that he felt like he needed to prove himself, and so he was trying to prove himself by becoming a hero and joining the Maquis. And that is what Kira even mentioned, like, oh, you're doing this to distinguish yourself from the other Riker and prove yourself. And you could also say that after the years, he kind of drifted apart, that him and Deanna drifted apart, that he kind of forgot about her. But, I'm sorry, but seeing how madly in love he was with her, I mean, it's different. His experience was different than William Riker's. So I just don't buy that just after this a few short years, he would just give up on her. And also, I don't buy that he would give up on his career in Starfleet either. But anyway, that's... And then he gets arrested. He gets into a prison, a Cardassian prison. We never see of this character in canon ever again. I was kind of hoping Lower Decks would bring him back, because in a later episode they mentioned him, Thomas Riker. But I think that's the first in canon reference that proves that he's no longer in a Cardassian prison, because they said, oh, Thomas Riker is around. So he's not in a Cardassian prison anymore. So that's canon, at least. There was out of canon, there was B canon stories that sort of I think there were different ones, like different books that had different outcomes of what happened to him. I mainly remember Imzadi Part 2, which I hated that book. I actually really loved Imzadi, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But Imzadi Part 2 was about a romance between Counselor Troi and Worf. Part of the reason why I hated it was, I think it was mainly about how they broke up. But because there was like bookends that had Worf shortly after Jadzia's death. But anyway, so Thomas Riker was the villain in that book. He was like the evil twin, and that makes his character so much worse. All respect to William Boimler. I think part of what I like about this episode is that they avoid the evil twin cliche. And Michael Piller and the other writers even talk about how they wanted to avoid the evil twin cliche, and thank God for that. Because that's why lore sucks, which unfortunately I'm going to talk about really soon. But, again, I should say. But, yeah, so that's why I hated Imzadi too, because they just made him evil. And I don't need an evil twin cliche. I'm sorry, I'm sick of it. And I'm glad that they avoided that in this episode. But I think in Zadi 2, he like made friend with a Cardassian prisoner, and they both broke out of the prison. But whatever, we don't know how he got out of the Cardassian prison. But anywho, that's getting into future stuff. This episode here. So part of the issue I have with this episode is that William, that is Commander Riker, I'll just call him William and the other one Thomas, just for clarification. Even though he doesn't pick the name Thomas till the end of the episode, still it's the easier way to differentiate them. Anyway, William Riker is a dick in this episode. And I think he's like totally, and he's like an arrogant prick too. I just don't like him in this episode. And I usually like Riker. Like, Riker's a cool guy. Like, I usually think he's amazing. Great character. I loved him in Chain of Command. He stuck up to that prick, the worst captain in Starfleet, Jellicoe. And he was great in Frame of Mind, seeing the inner minds and his nightmares come true and that stuff and how he deals with it. And so I like Commander Riker, and I did not like him in this episode. He was just being a dick to Thomas. I'm sorry. He was being, like, the whole poker scene was like, let's see who comes out on top. First of all, that just came out as very melodramatic and over the top and making a big deal out of everything. And just the interactions, the way he like, the way that, like, Thomas Riker goes around Picard to tell him his plan, and then William Riker tells him off, and it's like, you don't go around the captain, you tell me. Like, doesn't it seem familiar? It just seems really familiar. That's because they already fucking did this storyline with Shelby in the Best of Both Worlds. And I was like, yeah, so that kind of sucked. But on top of that, he's just treating Thomas like a dick. Because he was like telling him off, being like, you follow my orders. And so they go to the planet, and Thomas is like, what would you like me to do, sir? He's like, what are you waiting for? It's like, your orders, sir. Would you like me to proceed? And he's like, yeah, obviously. And then he like shakes his head like, idiot. And he laughs like he's a total fucking moron. But he's just sick of being dressed down and yelled at by you. And even like Data and Worf point out, like, oh, there's tension between them. Yeah, like William's being a total asshole to him. I know they're trying to be like, the thing Worf was talking about, like, oh, we're seeing something in your duplicate, something that you don't, about yourself, that reminds you about yourself that you don't like. But I think they overplayed it to the point where they made William completely unlikable. Like, just the way that he's constantly dressing him down. And even though, yes, Thomas is, and I think it's melodramatic at times, too. Like, the whole thing when Thomas, like, goes out of his way to defy Riker's order, or William, sorry, it's confusing, but to defy William's order, and goes, oh, I'm staying on the planet, don't worry, I'll catch up with you. And William grabs him, and you see the two Rikers standing next to each other. He yells at him, I gave you an order, Lieutenant. They just did that to create tension. It was overly dramatic, and it didn't need to be melodramatic, I should say. And they over-accentuated the, just how much William was bothered by him. They overdid it to the point where I think he was actively unlikable in this episode. Totally sided with Thomas. But anyway, one thing I do have to mention, though, is that Jonathan Frakes' performance this episode is amazing. Like, and this is something that apparently Marie DeSertis was talking about. She would joke to Jonathan Frakes, apparently, that, oh, I actually like Thomas better. Because the way he played Thomas is distinct and different. And I love that. It's subtle. And that's what makes it even more brilliant. That the more I watch it, like, I could, like, if there was a scene they didn't identify whether or not he was Thomas or William, Like the way they do in this episode is obvious to have the yellow shirt, the lieutenant yellow shirt, compared to the red commander shirt, and that's the easy go-to. But if they didn't have that, and they started a scene, and you see Jonathan Frakes standing there, and you don't know which one he is, as soon as he started talking and interacting with people, I would be able to pick it up from Frakes' amazing performance, because he had a distinct different way of performing Thomas that wasn't like too off. It wasn't over the top. As I said, it was subtle, but if you looked, you could definitely feel it more than like tell. So you could buy that it's still the same William Riker, but slightly different. And I think that's actually brilliant acting. And also, that's something I like about the story too. I love that they avoided the evil twin cliche. And I like the story about how his personality and would be different from if he was stuck on a planet for 8 years and dreaming of Deanna Troi, and had given up hope that anyone would ever return for him, and being just alone, and how that would have affected him and his character and made him sort of a different person. How he sort of... I honestly think... I mean, obviously, if he had beamed up, he would have acted the exact same as William Riker did, because they are the same person. They were, at that point, with the beaming happening, they were the same person. But now, after 8 years of being on that planet, I do think he's totally different. I do think if he was offered his own ship, he would take it. Because his experiences of being trapped and feeling abandoned and wanting to probably enhance his need to further his career, but also enhance his love for Deanna. And so that's why I buy his love for Deanna more. And I also I think it's a really nice touch that he said that he can't stay on the Enterprise, not while he's on board. But that implies that if William Riker wasn't on board, that Thomas would be willing to sort of hurt his career in order to stay on the Enterprise to be with Deanna. But honestly, again, this is kind of reminding me a bit of Lessons, and how it does the same thing where it has a romance of the week, and then at the end he was like, oh yeah, I'll go off to another ship and we'll definitely keep in touch, and then never talk to each other again. Which I think, similar to Lessons, that deflates the romantic storyline of the episode. And it's funny because it's not like this is a guest actor they couldn't bring back. It's a main cast member, Jonathan Frakes, so they could have easily brought this character back. But they just didn't want to. But to me, that deflates the point of this episode. The whole Thomas winning her back and doing all the little gifts and the puzzle treasure hunt thingy, which is, cutesy in a romantic comedy sort of way, but, romantic comedies aren't really my thing. so it wasn't, I didn't hate it, but it wasn't like really my thing. But I did like the romantic scenes between them, particularly the one in 10 Forward when he was talking about how he was dreaming of her and thinking, trying to will that he could reach out to her telepathically, and she was saying that she was also, when William abandoned her, she was also thinking, and maybe they were thinking of each other in some way. That was a powerful scene. I did like that. Not super powerful, but still, I did think it was a good scene. But yeah, for the most part, outside of that scene, again, I didn't hate this romance, but I wasn't really especially knowing that they never touch on it ever again. It's hard to get invested or to care that much about it. It was kind of interesting seeing, though, that it's calling back to the Riker and Troi relationship, which is something the show doesn't really do, and saying that what if things could have turned out differently, then Riker, their relationship would be different. And I think that would have been very interesting had they chose to continue this relationship, but they promptly abandoned it and put her back with Worf later in season 7. But oh my god, I'll get to that when I get to it. One thing that did bother me about this episode is the fact that Thomas was acting too sane. He was acting too well put together. I mean, he was trapped alone on the planet without any other company for 8 years. And also, like, I don't buy when they first meet. I get everyone's like so confused and wild and shocked that there's 2 Rikers, but still, Thomas should be really, really excited to be rescued. And it seems like he in the show he was all like just that I don't know who that other guy is, but I'm the real William Riker. And where he should have been more like, oh, thank God you rescued me. Oh, I'm so glad. But it's weird there's another me here, but who gives a shit, because I'm just glad to finally be off that damn planet. And they try to address this a little bit in the episode with him saying that it was strange being around people again. But that's not enough. Like, they definitely needed to do a lot. Like, he needed to act, like, weird. And he acts too much like he's a normal person. And he shouldn't be. He was trapped on the planet for 8 years. He should have a bit of PTSD from that, or just be a bit more awkward around people. But no, that is just me. Now, another thing I got to point out about this episode is, and I kind of forgot about this, but they have another scene with Deanna Troi and Dr. Crusher working out together. Now, I talked about the infamous workout scene where they were doing yoga or whatnot, or Pilates, and they were dressed scantily clad, and like we're going back and forth while they're talking about men. That was in the episode The Price in season 3, and how ridiculous that is, and people rightfully make fun of it. But I said that was the only scene where they did that. And I was correct. It's not wrong. That is the only scene where they did that particular workout. However, this episode features a scene of them doing the Worf's calisthenics thing. Now, they're wearing the white robes that everyone does, like Worf when he takes the classes. So it's not as bad, and they're not like holding each other and moving back and forth while they're talking about men. But still, they're exercising alone when they're talking about men. In this case, Tom Riker. So it reminded me a lot of that scene from The Price. Wasn't quite as bad, and it was their attempt to, have the girl talk between the only 2 main women characters. But yeah, it comes off a bit stereotypical. Granted, again, this scene not as bad as the other one, but still. But the other thing is, and I know some people might think this is silly, but I mentioned the book Imzadi. Well, I talked about Imzadi 2, which sucked, and that came out much later. But there was the first book just called Imzadi that came out before this episode. In fact, it was a very popular hardcover book. Maybe one of the most popular Star Trek TNG books. And so it was about like this alternate future where Deanna Troi died, and Admiral Riker in the future uses the Guardian of Forever to go back in time to try to save Deanna's life and convince younger Riker to do the right thing. And they also the book is intermixed with like prequel scenes that tell the backstory of Riker and Deanna when they were in Bajor. Not Bajor, getting my B planets mixed up. Beta Z. When they were on Beta Z, and how they first met. And so that went into detail about how they met and how they separated and everything like that. So when I saw this episode, they were kind of related a different story of how they met. Now this episode is canon. So this is the episode that really, this is the backstory that is the real thing. But I kind of like what the Mzadi book did better, and so especially when I was watching this episode, I was like, I couldn't help but think, well, this is off because that's not what happened. What happened was this other thing in the Mzadi book, which I don't really remember anymore. I just remembered that I liked it better, or I was more used to it. It was hard for me to switch, even though I knew it wasn't canon and that this actual canon TV show has the right to disregard anything that the silly books do. But this was just such a popular book and my favorite book. And so I had a hard time sort of getting used to this new canon that they made up, and I kind of still think that the book maybe did their romance a little better than this episode did, but that's kind of silly of me. The other thing I really had to mention, this is the first episode that LeVar Burton directed. It's very interesting indeed. He would direct a lot of episodes of Star Trek going forward, Deep Space Nine, Voyager. And became quite a good director. And he arranged for, I had her name out, but a real-life astronaut who was one of the first African-American women. I believe she was the first African-American woman in space. To play in this episode, she was played the transporter chief, or transporter operator, I should say, in one scene. And she, here it is, Dr. Mae Jemison. And and I remember hearing about that later and thinking, because I remember seeing this character, because she actually had a line, so it wasn't like they just got her as a background extra, and she did good for not actually being an actor. And later I found out this was an astronaut, and that they actually invited Nichelle Nichols to the set because Dr. Mae Jemison was a huge fan of horror, and that's why she wanted to do Star Trek, because Star Trek was a huge inspiration for her, and so they invited Nichelle Nichols, and they said that it was an amazing time. LeVar Burton talks about and there's some photo ops between the three of them. So that is kind of a really nice sort of feel-good story of Star Trek. You'll get the whole thing with what's his face, Hawkins, in a couple of episodes, but I'll get to that then. But anywho, the really interesting story I think about this episode is how originally the writers like Jerry Taylor, who was, as I said, was basically running the staff at this time, because Piller was devoting most of his time to DS9, but he was still involved. He still had the final say, which actually is a good thing. What I'm about to say is that Jerry Taylor and the other writers, particularly I believe Renee Echevarria and Ronald D. Moore and Brendan Braga, they wanted to kill off Commander William Riker in this episode and introduce Thomas Riker as a new character. So Lieutenant Riker would become the helmsman although there's different accounts, Jerry Taylor said he would be the ops operator. So, but I think it makes more sense of a helmsman. And Data would become the first officer. Now, part of me likes this idea, and for one reason and one reason alone, because I really wanted to see Data as the first officer. And honestly, the movies kind of treat Data more as the second star more than Jonathan Frakes. So I think it would have made a lot more sense just to make him the first officer. But outside of that, this idea is stupid. I'm sorry. I mean, I get that it would shake things up, and that's definitely something Ronald D. Moore likes to do. And the reason why Rick Berman and Michael Piller shot it down, and in fact, Michael Piller talks a lot about how he was against this idea. Michael Piller even says he was kind of personally insulted a little bit because he wrote Best of Both Worlds in the storyline of Riker and why he made the decisions he did, and why he chose to stay on the Enterprise, and he doesn't regret it because he made like the perfect life for him. And now we have this different version of Riker who's like, I don't know why you gave up all these commands, you idiot. He felt that was kind of degraded the character of William Riker, and it would have been ridiculous to get rid of this, kill him off, and get this other version of Riker when the audience wouldn't have any attachment to him because he spent 6 years building this great character. And so why are you going to throw it away to get like this different version that the audience doesn't really know? And Rick Berman, and rarely I agree with Rick Berman, so savor it. Rick Berman pointed out that, at this stage, they had an inkling. They weren't 100%, but they kind of knew that they were going to be doing movies soon. They kind of knew that the show was going to end soon, that they were going to do movies, and they didn't want to have movies with a new character of Thomas Riker that would be confuse the audience, and so they wanted to be consistent and have the same main characters that were there for the bulk of the show and keep William. And so thankfully that idea was shot down. As I said, the only reason I would have liked it is because I wanted to see Data as the first officer, and it would have been interesting to see a season 7. But here's the thing about that. I agree with Michael Piller that it would diminish the audience's attachment to the character of Riker, and thus to the show overall. It would kind of diminish them. It's like when other shows have to recast a character very late in the game, where, well, not recast, but like kill off a character and introduce a new one late in the game. It does have the effect, no matter how minor, of alienating the audiences a bit. One example I can give is Star Trek related, is Deep Space Nine, where Terry Farrell was fired, or left, but was basically chased off of the show. Yeah, technically she quit, but yeah, it's because Rick Berman was fucking dick, but that's another story. Anyway, so in season 6, there's only one season of the show left, and so in the very late stage, they had to, since it's a trill though, they had an easy out, is that they just gave the Dax symbiont to a different character, thus they could have a different actress play a different version, this time Ezri Dax instead of Jadzia Dax. Now, because of the situation that they were in with losing Terry Farrell, I agree. I know some people really didn't like Ezri, particularly a couple episodes that focused on her in season 7 they thought were terrible, but I like Ezri. I think she was a good character. I think Nicole DeBoer is an amazing actor. It's a shame she was only in one season of DS9. But I think that because of the situation they were in, they had no choice, especially, it's not the writer, it wasn't the showrunner, Ira Stephen Bear, or the writer's fault, the people actually responsible for making DS9. It wasn't their fault that Terry Farrell left. It was fucking Rick Berman. And so they had to deal with the situation as best they could. And so I think introducing Ezri was the ideal thing to do in that situation, because they were kind of dealt the cards, or you had to play the hand that you dealt, as they say, and I think that's the best way they could have done it. But why are you going to voluntarily do that to yourself if you don't have to? Like, if Terry Farrell wasn't leaving the show and she wanted to stay in the show, but they're like, now we're going to kill off your character and introduce a new character, Ezri, that would have been fucking stupid of them to do. Like, I commend them for doing it because they had to, because they had no choice, because they lost the actress. But if they voluntarily did that, that would have been idiotic. And this is essentially what they'd be doing, even though it's somewhat different because they keep the same actor. It would still be Jonathan Frakes either way. But story-wise, as far as the audience is concerned, it would be pretty much the same thing. It would be shooting yourself in the foot. It would be killing off a well-known character in order to replace it with a new character who's similar but not the same as the one that they killed off. So it's very similar to the Dax thing, actually. And as I said, like, the Dax thing is the best. They made the best out of a bad situation, whereas if they did it here, they don't have to do that. They're not in a bad situation. They're just making a bad situation out of nowhere. Like, they're in a good situation. You're just going to ruin it in the name of trying to shake things up. That would have been terrible. And I'm very glad that Michael Piller, and as I say, rare occasion, I agree with Rick Berman, that they made the right call in this case. Anyway, so I would now like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. This helps me continue with the channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Antarius and Brandon Neal House. Thank you so very much for the strong support that you give me. It's very much appreciated. And I would also like to give a shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelisio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you also very much for your support. So, we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Kyrie091, who says, "Second chances, more like Drek, the fan says." Actually, this was an interesting episode that presented some provocative ethical questions. Let's hope Thomas Riker never turns evil and seduces Kira. Now, if only they could use the transporter to clone Luoxana Troi so she could be on every ship at all times. Oh wait, she sort of is. Computer voice. Yeah, no, it just made me shiver thinking of Luoxana being on every ship. I mean, she showed up on DS9 when she had no fucking business being there, but that's another story which unfortunately I'm going to have to get into in my next review. But anywho, yeah, that's actually one of your better puns, I will say. Drek, this fan says. Well, maybe. I like it though. I think it's interesting. And I would argue that Thomas Riker on the episode Defiant isn't evil per se. He turned like Maquis, so he's more of an antagonist for sure. But after reading that book, as I said, Mzadi 2, he's flat out evil in that book, which I thought was terrible. Defiant, though, that I can tolerate, but I still say it's kind of a betrayal of how the character was portrayed in this episode. Just my humble opinion. One thing I really do want to give this episode praise for, however, is the fact that they didn't kill off Thomas Riker. That actually shocked me. Because, in fact, the writers even said that the risky thing they were going to do, the bold move they were going to make is not killing off Thomas, because that's what you would think they would do in an episode like this. In fact, they had that. I think they particularly were faking the audience out to make you think they were killing him. And it worked for me. That one scene when he was on the bridge and he fell and William was like holding him and he's like, let go! And I was like, oh yeah, here it comes. They're going to kill him off so they can do the tidy one-off episode to, hit that slam that reset button hard, make it so this other duplicate of Riker doesn't matter. Let's kill him off so they can wipe it all away. But no, they actually had the balls, and when Thomas Riker started climbing up and William saved his life, when I watched this episode for the first time, I was legitimately shocked. I was like, holy fuck, they're actually not killing him off? Not only was I shocked, I was shocked in a good way. Like, I was impressed. Because I was like, yeah, here they come. They're going to kill it and whatever. But no, they actually fucking saved him and actually had him. They did have him leave the ship, never to be seen again other than the DS9 episode where they just used him as an excuse to have an evil version of Riker. But they didn't kill him. So I was, really impressed by that. So next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, Will Riker attends movie night on the holodeck that was hosted by Berkeley. They are watching Friday the 13th Part 2. Riker leaves as he thinks it's dumb that Friday the 13th is a date people dread. The day is Friday the 13th. Will Riker beams to his ship 8 years later, supernatural time. I am Will Riker. I don't know who or what made it back to the Potemkin that day, but it wasn't me. Deanna Troi and Riker play Deanna Troi asks Riker to play Nightbird. If the song was called Night Robin, he would have been able to ace the solo. This was an interesting episode as we see past and present Riker. Will Riker had an experience like Picard that made him into the man that we see today, and that is the reason he's writing Tom's Urs, as he doesn't like what he sees. Worf has the best line in the episode. Worf, or perhaps it is more of a matter of seeing something in your double, something you do not like in yourself. The title of the episode should have been A Road Not Taken, as Thomas Riker does exactly the same as Will and leaves poor Deanna. This is the reason she ended up with Worf, as she couldn't take this love triangle, himself, myself, and Deanna. Movie quote time. So my rating is 7 my rating is 7 if is the universe ready for another Riker, and I can picture Shelby saying this, for fuck's sake, there's 2 of them now, out of 10. Don't even get me started on the whole Worf thing. That was just ridiculous. But, as far as Shelby, they actually kind of left on good terms, so I don't know if she would really be that upset with seeing Riker, but maybe sort of initial reaction. But yeah. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, of all the transporter malfunction episodes, this is certainly one of the better ones. Finally, they addressed the relationship between Riker and Troi. I liked Frakes' acting in this episode. He does a good job distinguishing the 2 Rikers. Some more or less minor nitpicks. Why does the Enterprise look for this data after 8 years? That seems as contrived as the Enterprise investigating Omicron Theta and data lore after a couple years. How did T. Riker survive on the station? Did the replicators work? But if so, why didn't the replicators replicate new clothes instead of wearing his raggy uniform? And I think it is unrealistic that T. Riker has no greater psychological problems after being alone for many years. How did the Rikers return after the bridge collapsed? If it was possible to beam them out there, why didn't they just beam down to the location in the first place? Because of all these little problems with the script, I will downgrade my rating to a strong 6 out of 10. That's a good point about the bridge. Like, I never thought about about it, but that's actually a very good point. How did they get out? Like, if they didn't need to walk through the bridge to get out, then why did they walk through the bridge in the first place? And if they could have been transported out, why didn't they just beam down there in the first place? I never thought. See, this is why I love the Patreon comments. I always bring up these little things I just didn't think about. Now, but as far as the replicators go, they actually did answer that in the episode. Well, they didn't answer why he didn't replicate himself new clothes, but they did say that he had food replicators, and he had a line where he said the replicators went offline like a couple months ago. So for the majority of the 8 years, he did have replicators, but in the last couple of months he had to eat rations. So that explains why he still had enough rations to survive, because he was only eating it for a couple months, and that also explains what he had to eat. Now, as far as why didn't he replicate himself new clothes, my headcanon on that is that he had a limited amount of power, and that's where the replicators went offline. Is when he sort of ran out of power, and he was on rations, so he was probably like counting the days, like eventually I'm going to starve to death, eventually I'm going to have nothing to eat. And so it was a good thing that the Enterprise showed up when it did, but of course he never mentioned that, which he should. But so my headcanon is that he had a limited amount of power, and he knew that the replicators would run out of it eventually, and so he used it sparingly. He only used it for important things like food. So he didn't. That's why he didn't replicate himself new clothes. But that's just my very weak headcanon in that matter. And the whole thing about the station being I don't get why this data is so important. They keep talking about, we have to go down and risk our lives, and we have to cross this shitty bridge, and we have to beam in order to get this data. It's so important to get this data. It will be lost forever. Like, why is the data that important that it's willing to risk someone's life over? I don't know. It seems like that was never really explained. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, I always have a soft spot for this episode, which is not only a Riker episode, but also a Troi episode. The dilemma / the scenario was novel at the time, and for interesting re-examination Riker had to do with an alternate self is definitely quite intriguing. Of course, more is talked about Tom and his role in DS9, and maybe even the mention of him in Lower Decks. We at least know, as of Lower Decks time, Tom is still alive. But for all the focus on Riker with himself, how Troi has to deal with the other Riker who at this present time is so smitten over her he's missed her for years is definitely quite intriguing, and thankfully Troi is more level-headed than, say, Jadzia Dax, Sisko, or Beverly Crusher. Granted, those three romance of the weeks, and in Crusher's case addicted to Space Ghost, but you know what I mean. Troi is conscious enough to step back, as she almost always does in all her relationships. Remember the time she sexually assaulted? There's no feeling at all from her end. 9 scavenger hunts with chocolates to enjoy out of 10. Well, is Troi always level-headed in her relationships? I'm thinking about the episode The Price, where she had a fling with a guy who was sleazy and obviously despicable. And then there's Masterpiece Society, when she slept with that dude who's the leader of her society and created a conflict of interest and then regretted it afterwards. So, yeah, I mean, she was being level-headed afterwards, but I don't know if I would say that she's always level-headed in her choice of relationship. She is here, and I agree. I like that. I think that is a nice touch, that and that she's coming in with her eyes open. So that, I think that kind of deflates, because I think one of the patrons mentioned something about Riker letting Deanna down yet again, but I think it deflates it because she kind of saw it coming and she was like preparing herself for it, so she didn't like go in completely deep to let herself get hurt. But they didn't really part on bad terms either. They parted on good terms. She understood why he had to leave, so I don't really see it as definitely not as painful as the initial breakup with Riker was. But yes, Lower Decks has proven, it hasn't said what Tom Riker is up to, it hasn't said how he got out of the Cardassian prison, but it's proven that he is out and still alive. And the after, when does Lower Decks takes place? It takes place sometime after Nemesis, or after Voyager, yeah. Well, after Nemesis. Nemesis was after Voyager. Anyway. Next comment is from Ricky, who says, "This was always a unique Riker episode for me, as we get to see two versions of him. The one that he is the man today and who we are familiar with, and Thomas, who was basically the past Riker if he never knew Picard and joined the Enterprise. Anyways, I did really like the interactions between them, and I always really liked the Troi aspect of it as well. This was a really good character study and growth of Riker, and I liked it. It's a shame we don't know the canon version of what happened to Thomas after the DS9 episode. So my rating is 8 out of 10. Well, we know he's alive, but we don't know. Yeah, we don't know exactly what happened or how he got out of the prison or anything like that. But yeah, seeing the two Rikers was, I don't know. I didn't like their interactions between each other. I think Tom was too flippant, and Will was too much of a dick. So I actually didn't really like. I think that seeing two Janeways in the episode Deadlock was actually much better than this. To be honest, this is the one that gets all the attention, though. And probably because this is a permanent thing, whereas the Deadlock thing was just, well, temporary. Because not both ships could survive. But anywho. But anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Second Chances out of 10 is going to be a 7. Very good. I gotta be honest, I had to re-record my rating for this because I originally gave it a 6, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought this episode actually deserved a 7, because it was an interesting concept of seeing the two different Rikers. Even though I didn't like how they interacted with each other, it was still interesting thought experiment to see how this William Riker differed from the other William Riker that had being trapped in a place for 8 years would affect his character and make them two totally different characters, and how he interacted with Troi and re-sparked the romance was very good. However, that being said, I think the episode was unnecessarily melodramatic in order to create tension. I think Will came off as a dick, which was very annoying. And, the whole Troi romance is undercut by the fact that we never see this romance ever again. It ends up being a one-off, which I think kind of degrades the importance of this romance. I mean, you could make a circular argument or some kind of argument that this is what sort of reinvigorated the passion that Deanna had for Riker, which eventually led to her getting together with William Riker in Insurrection. But I think you're a little bit on shaky ground, kind of like Thomas was when he was standing on that bridge. But I mean, one could make that inference, but I still say that no, that would be complete and total headcanon. That this, I really don't think the romance went anywhere, and so it's hard for me to really care or get invested in it. And I do like the concept, though, of the duplicate, and I do like that they were brave enough to keep him alive at the end of the episode, but still, it's not an episode that I would say is really great or really good or that I look forward to watching. It's just one of those meh episodes for me. Anyway, that is it for my review of Second Chances. So, coming up next on my channel, let's see here. Wednesday will be my review for The Forsaken. Thursday will be my review for Dramatis Persona. And Saturday will be my review for The Rings of Power, Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Season 2, where I review the whole season as a whole. And then on Monday, I will be over on the Patreon revisiting my review for one of the best episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, Duet. So that is what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.